In the summer of 1892, in a remote mining settlement called Copper Ridge, Montana, something extraordinary happened that would challenge everything the townspeople believed about destiny, difference, and divine purpose. A young woman with skin as pale as winter snow and hair like spun silver would transform from the community's most reviled outcast into a force that would reshape their understanding of what it meant to be truly blessed. But before we witness her triumph, we must first understand the darkness from which she emerged, a darkness that began the moment she drew her first breath in a world that saw her unique appearance as a curse rather than a gift. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The midwife's gasp echoed through the small cabin on the outskirts of Copper Ridge as she lifted the newborn into the flickering candlelight. What should have been a moment of celebration became one of horror and superstition as Martha Henderson stared at the infant in her trembling hands. The child was beautiful, perfectly formed, but her skin was the color of fresh milk, and the fine hair that crowned her head gleamed like moonbeams. "Dear Lord," Martha whispered, crossing herself with her free hand. "Sarah, I think there's something terribly wrong." Sarah Walker, exhausted from the difficult birth, struggled to sit up in her bed. She was 22 years old, married to Thomas Walker, one of Copper Ridge's most respected mine foremen. Their first child had been expected to bring joy to a marriage that had been blessed in every other way. Instead, the midwife's expression filled Sarah with a dread that settled deep in her bones. "Let me see her," Sarah demanded. Though her voice trembled with fear, Martha hesitantly placed the baby in her mother's arms, watching as Sarah's face cycled through confusion, shock, and something approaching terror. The infant's eyes, when they fluttered open, were a pale pink, almost translucent, giving her an otherworldly appearance that seemed to belong more to the spirit realm than the physical world. She's white as a ghost," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Martha, what does this mean? Why does she look like this?" Martha Henderson had delivered over 100 babies during her 30 years as Copper Ridge's midwife, but she had never encountered anything like this. In her experience, unusual appearances in newborns often indicated serious health problems, or, according to the superstitions that ran deep in frontier communities, spiritual afflictions that could bring misfortune to entire families. "I've heard stories," Martha said carefully, "about children born with the color drained from them. Some say it's a sign of being touched by dark forces. Others claim it means the child wasn't meant for this world." The baby, whom Sarah would eventually name Luna, seemed perfectly healthy despite her unusual coloring. She nursed eagerly, her tiny hands grasped firmly, and her cries were strong and clear. But in 1892 Montana, where survival depended on community acceptance and shared beliefs, being different was often more dangerous than being sick. Thomas Walker returned from his shift at the copper mine that evening, expecting to meet his son or daughter for the first time. Instead, he found his wife holding a bundle she seemed almost afraid to touch, while Martha Henderson paced nervously by the window. "Thomas," Sarah said, her voice barely audible, "something's wrong with our baby." When Thomas pulled back the blanket and saw his daughter for the first time, his reaction was immediate and devastating. The strong man who fearlessly descended into dangerous mine shafts every day took an involuntary step backward, his face draining of color as he stared at the infant. "What in God's name?" he began but couldn't finish the sentence. Luna's appearance defied every expectation Thomas had held about his future child. He had imagined a son with his dark hair and strong features, or a daughter with Sarah's warm brown eyes and rosy complexion. Instead, he found himself looking at a being who seemed to belong to a different species entirely. Martha Henderson had remained at the Walker cabin longer than usual, partly to ensure the baby's health, but mostly because she was uncertain about how to handle such an unprecedented situation. Her medical knowledge was limited to practical experience and folk wisdom, neither of which provided guidance for dealing with a child whose very existence challenged the community's understanding of normal human variation. "Thomas," Martha said. "Carefully, I've been thinking about what this might mean. There are stories, old stories from back east, about children born with this condition. Some call them moon children, others use less charitable terms. But they're not like other people." The implication was clear, though unspoken. In a frontier community where conformity and predictability were essential for survival, a child who looked fundamentally different would face challenges that went far beyond simple social awkwardness. Thomas Walker was a practical man who had built his reputation on solving problems efficiently and effectively. As he looked at his daughter, he saw not a unique individual with special needs, but a potential threat to everything he had worked to achieve in Copper Ridge. His position as mine foreman required the respect and trust of both the mining company owners and the workers under his supervision. Any scandal or unusual circumstance that attracted negative attention could jeopardize his career and, by extension, his family's economic security. "Sarah," Thomas said finally, his voice carrying a coldness that his wife had never heard before. "We need to think about what's best for everyone involved. This child, she's not normal. She's going to face a hard life, and she's going to make our lives harder too." Sarah clutched Luna more tightly, her maternal instincts warring with the growing fear that her husband might be right. She had seen how the people of Copper Ridge reacted to anything unusual or threatening. Just 2 years earlier, a family had been driven from town because their teenage son had suffered a head injury that left him with unpredictable behavior. The community's tolerance for difference was virtually non-existent. "But she's our daughter," Sarah whispered, though even as she spoke the words, she could feel her resolve weakening under the weight of social pressure she hadn't even directly experienced yet. The first test of the community's reaction came 3 days later when Martha Henderson, despite her promise of discretion, confided in her sister-in-law about the unusual birth. The news spread through Copper Ridge with the speed of wildfire, growing more dramatic and disturbing with each retelling. By the end of the week, the Walker family found themselves at the center of intense speculation and growing hostility. Neighbors who had been friendly for years suddenly avoided eye contact when they passed on the street. The general store clerk, who had previously extended credit without question, demanded immediate payment for all purchases. Even Reverend Michael Patterson, who prided himself on Christian compassion, seemed uncomfortable when Thomas and Sarah attended Sunday services. The turning point came during Luna's attempted baptism when she was 2 weeks old. Sarah had hoped that the religious ceremony would normalize their situation, demonstrating that despite her unusual appearance, Luna was simply another child deserving of community acceptance and spiritual protection. Instead, the baptism became a public spectacle that crystallized the town's rejection of the Walker family's attempts at normalcy. When Reverend Patterson lifted Luna from the baptismal font, her wet hair gleaming like silver in the church's morning light, several congregation members gasped audibly. One elderly woman, Mrs. Beatrice Thompson, stood up and pointed at the infant with a trembling finger. "That child is marked by darkness," she declared, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. "No natural child looks like that. She's been touched by evil, and keeping her among us will bring misfortune to our entire community." The accusation might have been dismissed as the ramblings of a superstitious old woman, if not for the murmurs of agreement that rippled through the congregation. People who had known the Walker family for years suddenly looked at them with suspicion and fear, as though Luna's unusual appearance might be contagious or spiritually dangerous. Reverend Patterson attempted to restore order, reminding his congregation about Christian charity and acceptance of all God's children. But his words carried little weight against the primitive fear that Luna's appearance had awakened in people who lived on the edge of survival in an unforgiving landscape. Perhaps, suggested Dr. James Morrison, the town's physician, it would be wise to have the child examined by specialists in Denver. This condition might be treatable, or at least better understood by medical professionals with more extensive experience. The suggestion was offered with good intentions, but it reinforced the community's perception that Luna represented a problem requiring expert intervention, rather than a unique individual deserving of acceptance. Thomas Walker found himself facing a choice that would define his family's future in Copper Ridge. He could continue defending his daughter's right to belong to the community, knowing that such efforts would likely result in social and economic isolation for his entire family. Or he could acknowledge the community's concerns and find alternative arrangements for Luna's care that would allow him and Sarah to maintain their place in Copper Ridge society. The decision was made easier by the economic pressure that began building as news of Luna's birth spread beyond the immediate community. The mining company's regional manager, Harold Stevens, visited Thomas privately to express concern about the unusual circumstances surrounding his family situation. "Thomas," Stevens said, his tone carefully neutral, "I want you to understand that your work performance has always been exemplary, and the company values your contribution to our operations. However, we've been receiving inquiries and comments about your domestic situation that are creating distractions in the workplace." The message was clear. Luna's presence was becoming a liability that could cost Thomas his job and, by extension, destroy his family's financial security. Sarah Walker, meanwhile, was experiencing her own form of community pressure through the systematic exclusion from social activities and support networks that were essential for frontier women's survival. The Ladies' Auxiliary, which had previously welcomed her participation in charitable activities and social gatherings, made it clear that her continued involvement would be contingent on resolving her family's unusual situation. "It's not that. We don't sympathize with your difficulties," explained Margaret Collins, the auxiliary's president. "But some of our members have expressed concerns about the appropriateness of certain associations. Perhaps it would be best if you focused on your family responsibilities until things become more settled." The isolation was devastating for Sarah, who had relied on these relationships for emotional support, practical assistance, and social identity. Without access to the community's informal networks of mutual aid, she found herself struggling with basic tasks like childcare, household management, and emotional processing of her challenging circumstances. But perhaps the most painful aspect of Luna's situation was the gradual recognition that her unusual appearance was not temporary or correctable. As weeks passed, it became clear that her pale skin, silver hair, and pink eyes represented permanent characteristics rather than temporary conditions that might resolve with time or medical intervention. Dr. Morrison had indeed arranged for consultation with medical specialists in Denver, but their conclusion was both definitive and discouraging. Luna suffered from a condition called albinism, a genetic variation that resulted in the absence of pigmentation in her skin, hair, and eyes. The condition was permanent, incurable, and would likely result in vision problems and extreme sensitivity to sunlight throughout her life. More troubling for the Walker family's social situation, the Denver specialists confirmed that albinism was hereditary, meaning that future children might also be affected. This information, when it reached Copper Ridge through Dr. Morrison's medical reports, intensified the community's desire to distance themselves from what they perceived as a contaminated bloodline. The final confrontation came on a cold October morning when Thomas Walker found a delegation of Copper Ridge's most prominent citizens waiting for him outside the mining company's headquarters. The group included Reverend Patterson, Mayor William Harrison, and several business owners who collectively represented the town's unofficial leadership council. "Thomas," Mayor Harrison began, his voice carrying the formal authority of his office. "We need to discuss the ongoing situation with your family. The community has been patient and understanding, but it's become clear that certain adjustments need to be made for the good of everyone involved." The adjustments they proposed were both simple and devastating. Luna would need to be removed from Copper Ridge permanently. The delegation had researched institutional options in distant cities, where children with unusual conditions could receive specialized care while allowing their families to resume normal social and economic relationships within their communities. "We understand this is difficult," Reverend Patterson added, his tone attempting to convey pastoral concern, "but we must consider what's best for the child as well as the community. She face a lifetime of stares, whispers, and isolation if she remains here. In a specialized facility, she could be among others who share her condition." Thomas Walker looked at the faces of men he had considered friends and colleagues, seeing nothing but cold calculation in their expressions. They weren't concerned about Luna's welfare. They were protecting their own comfort and social stability by removing the source of disruption and fear. That evening, Thomas presented Sarah with the community's ultimatum and his own decision to comply with their demands. The choice, as he presented it, was between Luna's immediate removal and the complete destruction of their life in Copper Ridge, including his job, their home, and any possibility of future acceptance by the only community they had ever known, Sarah's. Response was a mixture of heartbreak, rage, and desperate protection of her child. But she was 22 years old with no independent resources and no alternative support systems. In 1892 Montana, a woman's options for resisting her husband's decisions were virtually non-existent, particularly when those decisions had the support of the entire community. The arrangements were made quickly and quietly. Luna would be transported to a specialized institution in San Francisco that, according to the information provided by the community delegation, cared for children with unusual medical conditions. The cost would be covered by a collection taken up among Copper Ridge's leading families, presented as an act of Christian charity rather than an acknowledgement of their role in forcing the decision. On the morning of Luna's departure, she was 6 months old, a healthy, alert infant whose only crime was looking different from other people's expectations. As Sarah placed her daughter in the arms of the traveling companion who would escort her to California, she whispered promises that she would someday, find a way to bring her home. But Luna Walker would not return to Copper Ridge as the same helpless infant who had been rejected by a community too frightened and narrow-minded to recognize the extraordinary gift they were discarding. She would return as something far more powerful and dangerous to their comfortable assumptions about difference, destiny, and the true meaning of divine purpose. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The stagecoach that carried 6-month-old Luna Walker away from Copper Ridge rolled through the Montana wilderness on a crisp November morning in 1892, its wheels turning steadily toward a future that no one could have imagined. Beside her sat Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, a traveling companion hired by the community to ensure Luna's safe delivery to the Sanctuary of St. Catherine in San Francisco, an institution that specialized in caring for children with unusual medical conditions. Mrs. Fitzgerald was a widow in her 50s who had spent the last decade escorting difficult cases across the American West. She had transported children with various ailments, disabilities, and social problems to institutions where they could receive specialized care away from communities that lacked the resources or tolerance to accommodate their needs. In her experience, such arrangements usually benefited everyone involved, allowing families to resume normal lives while ensuring that vulnerable children received appropriate care. But Luna Walker was different from any child Mrs. Fitzgerald had previously escorted. Despite her unusual appearance, the infant was remarkably healthy, alert, and responsive. She ate well, slept peacefully, and showed none of the behavioral or developmental problems that typically accompanied the conditions Mrs. Fitzgerald had encountered in her work. "You're a strange little thing," Mrs. Fitzgerald murmured as she held Luna during one of their rest stops. "All this fuss over a bit of unusual coloring. I've seen children with far more serious problems who were kept happily at home with families who loved them." The journey to San Francisco took 12 days, during which Mrs. Fitzgerald found herself growing increasingly attached to her small charge. Luna's silver hair caught sunlight in ways that seemed almost magical, and her pale pink eyes held an intelligence that seemed far beyond her age. More troubling for Mrs. Fitzgerald's peace of mind, Luna seemed to respond to her presence with a trust and affection that suggested she was capable of forming strong emotional bonds despite her supposed spiritual affliction. The sanctuary of St. Catherine occupied a sprawling complex of buildings on the outskirts of San Francisco, surrounded by gardens and courtyards that provided peaceful environments for children whose conditions required specialized attention. The institution was operated by an order of Catholic nuns who had dedicated their lives to caring for society's most vulnerable and misunderstood children. Sister Maria Gonzalez, the sanctuary's director, greeted Mrs. Fitzgerald and Luna with the professional compassion that had made the institution renowned throughout the western United States. She was a woman in her 40s who had spent 20 years working with children whose families had been unable or unwilling to provide appropriate care for their special needs. "Welcome to St. Catherine's," Sister Maria said as she examined the documents that accompanied Luna's placement. "We've been expecting little Luna." The correspondence from Copper Ridge described her condition in rather dramatic terms, "but I see she appears quite healthy despite her unusual coloring." The sanctuary's approach to children with albinism was far more enlightened than anything Luna would have encountered in Copper Ridge. Sister Maria and her colleagues understood that albinism was a medical condition rather than a spiritual affliction, and they had developed specialized care protocols that addressed the practical challenges. While nurturing each child's individual potential, Luna was placed in the infant care ward, where she received round-the-clock attention from nuns who had been trained to work with children requiring special medical consideration. Her extreme sensitivity to sunlight necessitated careful protection during outdoor activities, and her vision problems required specialized equipment and techniques to support her development. But perhaps most importantly, Luna was surrounded by other children who faced similar challenges of being different in a world that often responded to difference with fear and rejection. The sanctuary housed children with various conditions that had made them unwelcome in their home communities: physical disabilities, developmental delays, unusual appearances, and behavioral problems that frontier settlements lacked the resources to address effectively. Sister Catherine Murphy, a young nun who had recently joined the order, was assigned as Luna's primary caregiver. Sister Catherine had grown up in Boston, where exposure to diverse populations had made her more accepting of human variation than many of her colleagues who came from rural backgrounds. She immediately recognized Luna's exceptional intelligence and responsiveness, noting that the infant seemed to understand and react to situations in ways that suggested advanced cognitive development. "This child is remarkable," Sister Catherine reported during the weekly staff meeting. "Her unusual appearance has obviously created problems for her family, but intellectually and emotionally, she appears to be developing well ahead of normal milestones. She's going to need educational opportunities that match her capabilities." As Luna grew from infant to toddler, her exceptional qualities became increasingly apparent to everyone who worked with her. Her silver-white hair grew in thick, lustrous waves that gleamed in artificial light, and her pale pink eyes seemed to absorb every detail of her environment with intense curiosity. More importantly, her intelligence manifested in ways that surprised even the experienced caregivers who had worked with hundreds of children over the years. By her second birthday, Luna was speaking in complete sentences and demonstrating reading readiness that typically didn't appear until age 4 or 5. Her memory was extraordinary, allowing her to recite long passages from books after hearing them only once or twice. Most remarkably, she seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of other people's emotions and motivations that gave her unusual insight into human behavior. Dr. Harrison Webb, a physician who consulted regularly at the sanctuary, conducted comprehensive examinations of Luna's development and concluded that her albinism had not affected her cognitive capabilities in any negative way. If anything, her heightened sensitivity to sensory input seemed to have accelerated certain aspects of her intellectual growth. "This child possesses exceptional potential," Dr. Webb reported to Sister Maria. "Her unusual appearance has clearly been a disadvantage socially, but intellectually, she may be gifted beyond our current ability to measure. She's going to require educational opportunities that extend far beyond what most institutions can provide." The sanctuary's educational program was designed to serve children with various learning needs, but Luna's capabilities quickly exceeded anything the standard curriculum could accommodate. Sister Catherine began developing individualized instruction that challenged Luna's advanced abilities while addressing the practical limitations imposed by her vision problems and sun sensitivity. Luna learned to read using specially designed large print materials and magnifying devices that accommodated her visual impairments. She studied mathematics, history, literature, and natural sciences with an appetite for knowledge that seemed insatiable. Most importantly, she began to understand her own condition, not as a curse or affliction, but as a unique characteristic that required adaptation rather than shame. "Why do I look different from other people?" Luna asked Sister Catherine during one of their afternoon tutoring sessions when she was 4 years old. Sister Catherine had been preparing for this question since Luna's arrival, understanding that the child would eventually need to comprehend her situation in ways that would help her build self-esteem rather than accepting the negative judgments that had shaped her early experiences. "God creates each person with unique gifts and challenges," Sister Catherine explained carefully. "Your appearance is unusual because you have a condition called albinism, which affects the coloring of your skin, hair, and eyes. Some people are frightened by things they don't understand, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you." Luna absorbed this explanation with the same intensity she brought to all learning, asking detailed questions about genetics, heredity, and the social dynamics that had led to her placement at the sanctuary. Even at 4 years old, she demonstrated an understanding of complex social issues that impressed the adults who worked with her. The sanctuary's library became Luna's favorite refuge, a place where she could explore worlds beyond the institutional walls that contained her daily life. She read voraciously, absorbing literature, history, and science with equal enthusiasm. Books became her window into possibilities that extended far beyond the limitations that others had tried to impose on her future. Sister Maria recognized that Luna's exceptional abilities would eventually require educational opportunities that the sanctuary could not provide. She began corresponding with universities and specialized schools that might be able to accommodate a student whose intellectual gifts were complicated by physical limitations and unusual social circumstances. "We're dealing with a truly exceptional mind," Sister Maria wrote to the Dean of Academic Affairs at the University of California. "This young woman will require institutional support that can nurture her intellectual potential while addressing the practical challenges created by her medical condition and social background." But Luna's development at the sanctuary involved more than academic achievement. She was learning valuable lessons about resilience, self-advocacy, and the importance of building communities based on acceptance rather than fear. The other children at St. Catherine's faced their own challenges, and Luna developed deep friendships with peers who understood what it meant to be rejected by society for characteristics beyond their control. Marcus Thompson was a boy her age, who had been born with a severe cleft palate that made speech difficult and eating challenging. Rebecca Martinez had lost her left arm in an accident and had been rejected by her family as incomplete and therefore unmarriageable. David Chun had developmental delays that made him slower than other children, but possessed a gentle kindness that made him beloved by everyone at the sanctuary. These friendships taught Luna that human worth was not determined by physical appearance or social acceptance, but by character, intelligence, and the capacity for love and loyalty. She learned to see her own difference not as a burden to be hidden, but as one of many variations in human experience that deserved respect rather than fear. As Luna approached her 5th birthday, Sister Catherine began discussing her future educational path with the sanctuary's administrators. It was becoming clear that Luna's intellectual development would soon exceed what the institution could provide, necessitating placement in specialized programs that could challenge her exceptional abilities. She's already reading at a high school level and solving mathematical problems that challenge much older students, Sister Catherine reported. More importantly, she's developing leadership qualities that suggest she could eventually help other people who face similar challenges of social rejection and discrimination. The conversation about Luna's future took on new urgency when Dr. Webb discovered that her vision problems, while significant, were not as limiting as originally feared. With proper corrective lenses and careful attention to lighting conditions, Luna could function academically at levels that approach normal visual capabilities. This changes everything, Dr. Webb explained to Sister Maria. If Luna can overcome the visual limitations through assistive technology, her intellectual capabilities suggest she could eventually pursue higher education and professional careers that were previously unimaginable for someone with her condition. But even as Luna's future possibilities expanded through educational opportunities, she never forgot the family and community that had rejected her. Sister Catherine had carefully preserved the few mementos that had accompanied Luna from Copper Ridge: a baby blanket knitted by her mother, a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, and a photograph of her parents taken on their wedding day. Luna studied these objects with the same intensity she brought to her academic work, trying to understand the people who had given her life and then given her away. She asked detailed questions about Copper Ridge, about mining communities, and about the social dynamics that had led to her exile. "Do you think they ever wonder what happened to me?" Luna asked Sister Catherine during one of their conversations about her origins. "I'm certain they do," Sister Catherine replied honestly. "People who make difficult decisions often spend years questioning whether they chose correctly. Your parents loved you, Luna, but they were frightened by circumstances they didn't understand." These conversations planted seeds of curiosity about her origins that would eventually grow into a determination to return to Copper Ridge and confront the community that had rejected her. But for now, Luna was focused on building the knowledge, skills, and emotional strength that would be necessary for whatever challenges her future might hold. As her 6th birthday approached, Luna Walker was no longer the helpless infant who had been shipped away from Copper Ridge in shame. She was becoming a formidable young person whose exceptional intelligence, deep compassion, and growing understanding of social justice would eventually make her a powerful advocate for others who faced discrimination and rejection. The sanctuary had provided her with far more than basic care and education. It had given her a foundation of self-worth, a community of acceptance, and the beginning of a vision for how society could be transformed to value difference rather than fearing it. Luna Walker was preparing to become someone extraordinary, though no one yet understood just how dramatically she would eventually reshape the world that had once deemed her too dangerous to keep. When Luna Walker turned 8 years old in 1900, her extraordinary intellectual capabilities had attracted the attention of Professor Jonathan Mitchell from Stanford University, who arrived at the sanctuary of St. Catherine on a warm spring morning that would forever change the trajectory of her life. Professor Mitchell was a renowned educator who specialized in identifying and nurturing exceptional minds, regardless of their social circumstances or physical challenges. Sister Maria had written to Professor Mitchell after exhausting the sanctuary's educational resources trying to keep pace with Luna's accelerating intellectual development. The young girl was now reading university-level texts with complete comprehension, solving complex mathematical equations that challenged graduate students, and demonstrating an understanding of social and political theory that impressed even the most educated adults who worked with her. Sister Maria, Professor Mitchell said as he reviewed Luna's academic portfolio, in 30 years of educational work, I have never encountered a mind quite like this child's. Her intellectual capabilities are extraordinary, but more importantly, she possesses the kind of moral reasoning and social awareness that suggests she could become a transformative figure in whatever field she chooses to pursue. Luna's first meeting with Professor Mitchell took place in the sanctuary's library, surrounded by the books that had become her closest companions during 6 years of institutional life. She wore specially designed dark glasses to protect her sensitive eyes from the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and her silver-white hair was braided in the simple style that Sister Catherine had taught her for practical convenience. Miss Walker, Professor Mitchell began, I understand. You've been studying subjects that most children your age haven't even heard of. Would you mind sharing your thoughts on some of the material you've been reading? What followed was a 2-hour conversation that convinced Professor Mitchell that Luna possessed not just exceptional intelligence, but the kind of comprehensive understanding that typically took decades to develop. She discussed philosophy, literature, mathematics, and natural sciences with insights that revealed both broad knowledge and deep analytical thinking. I've been particularly interested in the social contracts theory, Luna explained with the serious demeanor that characterized her approach to intellectual discussions. Rousseau argues that civilization requires people to surrender certain natural freedoms in exchange for collective security. But I've been wondering whether communities have the right to exclude individuals who don't conform to their expectations of normalcy. The question was clearly rooted in Luna's personal experience of rejection, but her ability to transform that experience into sophisticated philosophical inquiry impressed Professor Mitchell enormously. This was not a bitter child seeking revenge, but a young scholar trying to understand the fundamental principles that governed human society. Professor Mitchell's recommendation resulted in Luna's acceptance into an experimental educational program that Stanford University had developed for exceptionally gifted students who required individualized instruction. The program allowed Luna to continue living at the sanctuary while pursuing advanced coursework through correspondence and periodic visits to the university campus. Luna's transition to university-level education occurred gradually, with Sister Catherine continuing to serve as her primary mentor and support system. The arrangement allowed her to maintain the emotional stability provided by the sanctuary community, while accessing educational opportunities that could fully challenge her exceptional abilities. Her first formal course was in classical literature, taught through correspondence by Professor Alice Thornton, a renowned scholar who had initially been skeptical about working with such a young student. Luna's first assignment was to write a comparative analysis of Greek tragic heroines, focusing on how their fates were determined by social expectations versus personal choices. Professor Thornton expected a competent but elementary response appropriate for an 8-year-old student. Instead, she received a 15-page essay that demonstrated not only comprehensive understanding of the literary works, but sophisticated analysis of how ancient social dynamics paralleled modern discrimination against individuals who deviated from cultural norms. Miss Walker, Professor Thornton wrote in her response, your analysis of Antigone's conflict with Creon as a metaphor for individual conscience versus social authority is remarkably sophisticated. You've identified themes that most graduate Students struggle to articulate clearly. I'm eager to see how your thinking develops as we explore other works. Luna's mathematical studies progressed even more rapidly under the guidance of Dr. Samuel Richardson, a professor who had initially agreed to work with her as a favor to Professor Mitchell. Dr. Richardson discovered that Luna possessed an intuitive understanding of mathematical relationships that allowed her to grasp complex concepts with minimal explanation. She doesn't just solve problems, Dr. Richardson explained to his colleagues. She understands the underlying principles that make the solutions possible. More remarkably, she can often identify patterns and connections that lead to new insights. About mathematical relationships. Luna's natural sciences studies were conducted partly through laboratory work at Stanford and partly through independent research projects that she pursued at the sanctuary. Her biology studies were particularly fascinating to her, as she sought to understand the genetic mechanisms that had created her own unusual characteristics. Dr. Margaret Foster, the professor who supervised Luna's biology coursework, was initially concerned that the young student might become obsessed with her own condition in unhealthy ways. Instead, Luna's personal experience with genetic variation motivated her to develop a broader understanding of human diversity and adaptation. I want to understand why some genetic variations are considered beautiful while others are feared, Luna explained to Dr. Foster during one of their laboratory sessions. My appearance frightens people, but I've read about cultures where pale skin is considered particularly attractive. The difference seems to be social rather than biological. These insights led Luna to develop an interest in anthropology and sociology that complemented her other academic pursuits. She began studying how different cultures responded to physical variation, discovering that attitudes toward albinism varied dramatically across societies and historical periods. Professor David Martinez, who taught Luna's anthropology courses, found her perspective on cultural differences uniquely valuable because of her personal experience with social rejection. She could analyze discrimination not just as an academic concept, but as a lived reality that she understood intimately. Luna brings a perspective to these studies that most scholars never develop, Professor Martinez wrote in his evaluation of her work. She understands viscerally how social structures exclude and marginalize individuals, giving her insights into power dynamics that are typically invisible to members of privileged groups. But Luna's most transformative educational experience came through her study of law and social justice under Professor Elizabeth Harper, a pioneering legal scholar who had devoted her career to expanding rights for marginalized populations. Professor Harper recognized that Luna's combination of exceptional intelligence and personal experience with discrimination could make her a powerful advocate for social change. The law is not just a set of rules, Professor Harper explained during one of Luna's visits to the Stanford campus. It's a tool that can be used either to reinforce existing power structures or to transform society in ways that create greater justice and equality. Your background gives you unique insights into how legal systems can be used to protect vulnerable individuals. Luna absorbed these lessons with the same intensity she brought to all her studies, but Professor Harper's teachings carried special significance because they offered a pathway for transforming her personal experience of injustice into broader social change. I want to understand how communities like Copper Ridge justify their treatment of people they consider different, Luna told Professor Harper. If I can understand their reasoning, maybe I can develop legal arguments that would force them to reconsider their assumptions. Luna's legal studies led her to research historical cases involving discrimination against individuals with unusual physical characteristics. She discovered that legal protections for such individuals were virtually non-existent, and that most courts had consistently upheld communities' rights to exclude or institutionalize people whose appearances challenged social norms. The legal system generally supports majority preferences over individual rights when dealing with physical difference, Luna concluded in a research paper that impressed Professor Harper with its sophisticated analysis. But I believe this could be changed if the right cases were brought before courts that were willing to consider fundamental questions about human equality and social inclusion. By the time Luna turned 10 years old, she had completed coursework equivalent to a university bachelor's degree in multiple fields. Her academic achievements were remarkable, but equally impressive was her development as a person who had transformed personal adversity into intellectual strength and moral clarity. Dr. Webb, who continued to monitor Luna's medical condition, noted that her exceptional intellectual development had been accompanied by physical maturation that exceeded normal expectations. Her vision problems, while still significant, had been largely overcome through specialized corrective lenses and lighting techniques. More importantly, her confidence and social skills had developed to the point where she could interact effectively with adults who initially found her appearance disturbing. Luna has become one of the most remarkable young people I've ever encountered, Dr. Webb reported to Sister Maria. Her intellectual capabilities are extraordinary, but her character development has been equally impressive. She's learned to transform potential bitterness into compassion, isolation into independence, and personal experience into social understanding. Luna's relationship with the other children at the sanctuary had also evolved as she grew older. She had become a mentor and advocate for younger children who struggled with self-esteem, issues related to their own differences. Her academic success provided them with an example of what could be achieved despite social rejection and physical challenges. Marcus Thompson, her childhood friend with the cleft palate, had benefited enormously from Luna's encouragement and tutoring. Under her guidance, he had developed communication skills and academic abilities that exceeded what anyone had expected when he first arrived at the sanctuary. Luna taught me that our differences don't have to define our limitations, Marcus explained to Sister Catherine. She showed me that if we work hard enough and believe in ourselves strongly enough, we can achieve things that other people think are impossible. But perhaps Luna's most significant development during this period was her growing determination to eventually return to Copper Ridge and confront the community that had rejected her. This wasn't motivated by desire for revenge, but by a sophisticated understanding of how social change occurs through individual courage and moral leadership. "I'm not angry with the people who sent me away," Luna explained to Sister Catherine during one of their evening conversations. "But I am committed to ensuring that no other child experiences what I experienced. The only way to change discriminatory attitudes is to confront them directly and demonstrate their fundamental injustice." Sister Catherine understood that Luna's exceptional education was preparing her not just for academic success, but for a confrontation with social prejudice that would require every intellectual and emotional resource she had developed during her years at the sanctuary. As Luna approached her 11th birthday, she was no longer the frightened infant who had been rejected by Copper Ridge. She had become a formidable young scholar, whose exceptional abilities and moral clarity would soon be directed toward transforming the very community that had once deemed her too dangerous to keep. The foundation had been laid for a return that would challenge everything Copper Ridge believed about difference, destiny, and the true meaning of human worth. The summer of 1904 brought an unexpected visitor to the sanctuary of St. Catherine that would forever change Luna Walker's understanding of her destiny and her connection to the world beyond institutional walls. On a humid August morning, a weathered man in his 60s appeared at the sanctuary gates, asking specifically to meet the Moonchild, whose reputation had somehow reached his remote corner of the American Southwest. Joseph Crow Feather was a medicine man from the Navajo Nation who had traveled over 800 miles based on dreams and visions that had been troubling him for months. His presence at the Catholic sanctuary created immediate tension, as the nuns were uncertain about allowing what they viewed as pagan spiritual practices to influence their carefully structured environment. I have come because the spirits have shown me the white-haired child who carries ancient prophecy. Joseph explained to Sister Maria through a translator, though his English was actually quite good. She is not cursed as the white people believe. She is blessed with the mark of the moon spirits, and her destiny is to bring great changes to the world. Sister Maria's initial impulse was to politely refuse the strange visitor's request. The sanctuary had worked hard to help Luna develop a healthy understanding of her condition, based on medical science rather than superstition, and she was reluctant to expose the young girl to what might be harmful mystical thinking. But Luna herself, now 12 years old and possessed of formidable intellectual curiosity, insisted on meeting the medicine man who had traveled so far specifically to see her. Her advanced studies in anthropology had given her deep appreciation for indigenous spiritual traditions, and she recognized an opportunity to learn about perspectives on albinism that differed dramatically from both the fearful rejection she had experienced in Copper Ridge and the clinical acceptance she had found at the sanctuary. The meeting between Luna and Joseph Crow Feather took place in the sanctuary's garden under the careful supervision of Sister Catherine and Dr. Webb. Luna wore her characteristic dark glasses and wide-brimmed hat to protect herself from the afternoon sun, while Joseph sat cross-legged on a blanket he had spread beneath a large oak tree. "Child of the moon," Joseph said in English as he studied Luna's distinctive appearance, "you have been marked by ancient spirits for a purpose that your people do not understand. In our traditions, those born with your coloring are considered sacred messengers who appear during times when great changes must come to the world." Luna listened with the respectful attention she brought to all learning opportunities, though her scientific education made her skeptical of supernatural explanations for genetic conditions. However, Joseph's next words captured her attention in ways that purely spiritual claims could not. "My grandmother told me stories passed down through many generations about the moon children who would appear when indigenous peoples and white settlers needed to find new ways of living together." Joseph continued, "These special ones would understand both worlds because they had been rejected by one and embraced by the other. They would become bridges between different ways of seeing and being." The concept of serving as a bridge between different worldviews resonated powerfully with Luna's own experience of existing between the rejection of mainstream society and the acceptance of institutional care. More intriguingly, Joseph's description suggested that her unusual appearance might have positive significance in cultural contexts she had never encountered. "In our ceremonies," Joseph explained, "we pray for the moon children to come when our people face challenges that require new kinds of wisdom. Your appearance in these times of great change between Indian and white peoples suggests that you may have been sent to help both communities find better ways of understanding difference and diversity." Dr. Webb, who had been listening to this conversation with professional skepticism, found himself intrigued by the psychological implications of Joseph's perspective. Luna had always struggled with questions about her purpose and destiny, and the medicine man's interpretation offered a framework for understanding her difference as meaningful rather than merely unfortunate. "Mr. Crow Feather," Dr. Webb interjected, "while I don't share your spiritual beliefs, I'm curious about how your cultural traditions have historically approached individuals with Luna's condition. Have they generally been accepted within your communities?" Joseph's response revealed a profound difference between indigenous and European American attitudes toward physical variation that illuminated some of the social dynamics Luna had experienced in her own life. "Among our people, those who are different in appearance are often considered to have special spiritual gifts," Joseph explained. "We believe that the Great Spirit creates variation for purposes we may not immediately understand, but which serve the larger balance of life. A person's worth is determined by their character and their contributions to the community, not by how closely they match expectations of normal appearance." This philosophy stood in stark contrast to the fear and rejection Luna had experienced. in Copper Ridge, where difference had been interpreted as threat rather than gift. The conversation continued for several hours, during which Joseph shared stories from various Native American traditions that portrayed individuals with albinism as powerful spiritual figures rather than cursed outcasts. The Hopi people tell of white-haired prophets who would appear during times of great difficulty to guide the people toward new understanding, Joseph said. The Cherokee speak of moon spirits who take human form to teach lessons about acceptance and the value of all living beings. Your appearance connects you to these ancient traditions of wisdom and healing. Luna found herself deeply moved by these alternative interpretations of her condition, not because she necessarily believed in their supernatural elements, but because they offered a framework for understanding her difference as potentially valuable rather than merely unfortunate. For the first time since leaving Copper Ridge, she began to consider that her unusual appearance might actually be an advantage in certain contexts, rather than simply an obstacle to overcome. More practically, Joseph's visit introduced Luna to networks of indigenous communities throughout the American West that might provide her with allies and supporters when she eventually pursued her goals of social change and justice advocacy. He extended an invitation for her to visit Navajo territory and learn more about traditional approaches to healing and community building. Your education in white schools has given you powerful tools, Joseph acknowledged, but our traditional knowledge could add different kinds of strength that might help you accomplish your destiny. The combination of both worlds' wisdom could make you more effective in your work to change hearts and minds. Sister Maria was initially hesitant about allowing Luna to spend time in what the Catholic Church considered pagan environments, but Professor Harper, who had become Luna's primary mentor in legal and social justice matters, strongly supported the opportunity. Luna's effectiveness as an advocate for social change will depend partly on her ability to build coalitions across different communities, Professor Harper argued. Understanding indigenous perspectives on difference and inclusion could provide her with valuable insights that aren't available through traditional academic study. The decision was made to allow Luna to spend several weeks during the summer of 1905 visiting various Native American communities throughout the Southwest, accompanied by Joseph Crow Feather and supervised by anthropology professors from Stanford, who could ensure her safety while documenting her experiences for academic purposes. Luna's first visit to the Navajo Nation was a revelation that expanded her understanding of human social organization in ways that all her academic study had not prepared her to anticipate. She was welcomed not as a curiosity or object of pity, but as an honored guest whose unusual appearance was interpreted as evidence of spiritual significance rather than medical abnormality. The contrast with her reception in Copper Ridge could not have been more dramatic. Children gathered around her with fascination rather than fear. Elderly people sought her out for conversations about dreams and visions, and community leaders treated her with the respect typically accorded to important visitors rather than the suspicion she had learned to expect from white communities. Among our people, explained Sarah Begay, an elderly woman who served as one of the community's traditional healers, physical differences are often signs that a person has been chosen for special purposes by the spirits. Your appearance suggests that you have been marked for important work that will benefit many people. Luna's time with the Navajo community provided her with practical education in alternative approaches to social organization that complemented her academic studies in law and political theory. She observed how indigenous communities made decisions through consensus rather than majority rule, how they balanced individual rights with collective responsibility, and how they integrated spiritual values with practical governance. Most importantly, Luna learned about traditional healing practices that addressed not just physical ailments, but social and spiritual disorders that affected entire communities. She discovered that Native American medicine men and women often served as mediators in disputes, counselors for individuals facing personal crises, and guides for communities struggling with difficult transitions. Healing is not just about curing individual sickness, Joseph explained during one of their conversations about traditional medicine practices. It's about restoring balance and harmony to relationships between people, between communities, and between human beings and the natural world. These concepts gave Luna new frameworks for understanding her own goals of returning to Copper Ridge and addressing the social dynamics that had led to her rejection. Instead of simply seeking personal vindication or revenge, she began to envision her eventual confrontation with the mining community as an opportunity for collective healing and transformation. Luna's visits to other indigenous communities during the summer of 1905 reinforced the lessons she had learned among the Navajo people. The Hopi welcomed her as a potential fulfillment of prophecies about white-haired messengers who would appear during times of cultural change. The Cherokee shared stories about moon spirits who took human form to teach lessons about acceptance and diversity. Perhaps most significantly, Luna met other individuals with albinism who had found acceptance and purpose within indigenous communities rather than facing the rejection and institutionalization that characterized European American responses to genetic variation. Maria Gonzalez was a woman in her 30s who had been born into a Pueblo community and had become a respected artist whose distinctive appearance was considered an asset rather than a liability in her work creating ceremonial pottery and textiles. Her silver-white hair and pale skin were incorporated into her artistic identity in ways that made her work distinctive and valuable. "I have never experienced the kind of rejection you describe from white communities," Maria told Luna during their conversation about living with albinism in different cultural contexts. "My people see my appearance as evidence that I have been blessed with special creative abilities. My art is sought after specifically because I am different, not despite my difference." These encounters taught Luna that social attitudes toward physical variation were culturally constructed rather than biologically determined, and that communities could choose to value diversity rather than fearing it. More importantly, she learned that her own difference could be transformed from a source of exclusion into a foundation for leadership and social change. When Luna returned to the sanctuary of St. Catherine after her summer with various Native American communities, she carried with her a transformed understanding of her identity and destiny. She was no longer simply a rejected child seeking acceptance, or an exceptional student pursuing academic achievement. She had become someone who understood her role as a bridge between different worlds and different ways of understanding human value and social organization. "The indigenous communities have taught me that my appearance is not something to overcome or hide," Luna explained to Sister Catherine upon her return. "It's something to embrace as a source of strength and a foundation for the work I need to do in the world." This new understanding would prove crucial as Luna prepared for the next phase of her development, the transformation from exceptional student into powerful advocate for social change, who would eventually return to Copper Ridge with both the intellectual tools and spiritual confidence necessary to challenge the community that had once rejected her as cursed. By 1907, when Luna Walker turned 15, she had completed what would typically be considered doctoral-level education in multiple disciplines. But more importantly, she had begun translating her exceptional academic achievements into practical strategies for social transformation. The combination of her university education and her experiences with Native American communities had given her a unique perspective on how systemic change could be achieved through careful planning, strategic alliances, and patient execution. Professor Elizabeth Harper had become Luna's primary mentor in developing what they privately called the Copper Ridge Project, a comprehensive plan for returning to her birthplace with sufficient resources and authority to confront the discrimination that had shaped her early life. The project represented far more than personal vindication. It was designed as a model for how marginalized individuals could challenge systemic prejudice through legal, Economic and social pressure. Luna, Professor Harper explained during one of their strategic planning sessions, your case represents an opportunity to establish legal precedents that could protect other individuals from the kind of systematic exclusion you experienced. But success will require more than just moral arguments. You'll need economic leverage, legal expertise, and community allies who can support your efforts. Luna's first step toward building this foundation was establishing her own sources of financial independence through innovative applications of her exceptional intellectual abilities. Working with Professor Mitchell and other academic mentors, she had begun developing educational materials and consulting services that could generate substantial income while advancing her broader social justice goals. Her breakthrough came through creating specialized curricula for teaching children with various learning differences and physical challenges. Luna's personal experience with overcoming visual limitations, combined with her advanced understanding of pedagogy and child development, enabled her to design educational approaches that were far more effective than traditional methods. Walker Method for Inclusive Education began attracting attention from school systems throughout California and the broader Western United States. Educators discovered that Luna's techniques for accommodating individual differences actually improved learning outcomes for all students, not just those with special needs. Dr. Patricia Morrison, superintendent of San Francisco's school system, became one of Luna's first major clients after observing remarkable improvements in classrooms that implemented her methods. Ms. Walker's approach to education recognizes that all children learn differently. Dr. Morrison explained to the city's school board, her methods don't just help students with obvious challenges. They create learning environments where every child can reach their full potential. We need to expand these programs throughout our entire system. The consulting fees and licensing agreements for Luna's educational innovations provided her with financial resources that far exceeded what most 15-year-olds could imagine. More importantly, the work established her professional reputation as an expert in inclusive education and social integration, credentials that would prove valuable when she eventually returned to Copper Ridge. Luna's legal education under Professor Harper's guidance had progressed to the point where she was conducting original research on discrimination, law, and civil rights protections. Her academic papers were being published in prestigious law journals, and several had been cited in court cases involving individuals with disabilities and unusual physical characteristics. Her most significant legal research focused on developing constitutional arguments for protecting individuals from community-based exclusion based on physical appearance. Luna had identified gaps in existing civil rights law that left people like herself vulnerable to systematic discrimination without legal recourse. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause has never been applied to cases involving genetic physical variation. Luna wrote in a law review article that gained national attention. Communities currently have broad authority to exclude individuals based on appearance, but this power conflicts with fundamental principles of individual liberty and equal treatment under law. These legal arguments were not merely academic exercises. Luna was building the intellectual foundation for court cases that could eventually force communities like Copper Ridge to change their discriminatory practices or face serious legal consequences. With Professor Harper, Luna had identified several test cases involving individuals who had faced community exclusion, similar to her own experience. They were developing litigation strategies that could establish protective precedents while avoiding the risks associated with premature legal challenges. We need to choose our cases carefully, Professor Harper advised. The first few decisions will determine whether this approach succeeds or whether it creates adverse precedents that make future progress more difficult. Your situation in Copper Ridge might eventually provide the perfect test case, but only after we've established favorable legal groundwork through other litigation. Luna's work with Native American communities had continued to expand during this period, providing her with increasingly sophisticated understanding of alternative approaches to social organization and conflict resolution. She had become a regular participant in intertribal councils focused on developing strategies for protecting indigenous rights while building positive relationships with non-native communities. Chief Robert, Standing Bear of the Lakota Nation, had become one of Luna's most important mentors in understanding how marginalized communities could effectively challenge dominant power structures without triggering destructive backlash. True power comes not from forcing others to accept you, Chief Standing Bear explained during one of their conversations about social change strategies, but from creating circumstances where they benefit from accepting you. When people discover that including you serves their own interests, resistance becomes much less likely. This wisdom shaped Luna's developing strategy for confronting Copper Ridge. Instead of simply demanding acceptance or seeking revenge for past wrongs, she began planning an approach that would make her inclusion economically and socially advantageous for the community that had once rejected her. Luna's reputation within academic and legal circles had grown to the point where she was regularly invited to speak at conferences and symposiums focused on education, civil rights, and social justice. These speaking engagements provided her with platforms for advancing her ideas while building networks of professional allies who could support her future work. Her presentation at the provided her with platforms for advancing her ideas while building networks of professional allies who could support her future work. Her presentation at the platforms for advancing her 1907 National Conference on Progressive Education drew standing ovations and extensive press coverage that brought her ideas to national attention. Luna's speech focused on the social cost of educational exclusion, arguing that communities damage themselves by failing to develop the full potential of all their members. When we exclude individuals based on difference rather than inability, Luna told the assembled educators, we waste human resources that could contribute significantly to our collective prosperity and progress. The child who looks different may possess exactly the innovative thinking our communities need to solve their most challenging problems. The speech was widely reprinted in educational journals and newspapers throughout the country, establishing Luna as a national voice for inclusive education and social justice. More importantly, the publicity generated interest from individuals and organizations who wanted to support her work financially and professionally. Mrs. Catherine Vanderbilt, a wealthy philanthropist and education reformer, approached Luna after her conference presentation with an offer that would significantly accelerate her timeline for returning to Copper Ridge. Miss Walker, Mrs. Vanderbilt said, I have been looking for innovative educators who could help establish model schools that demonstrate better approaches to serving diverse student populations. Your methods and your personal story suggest that you could create something truly transformational. I would like to fund a comprehensive educational initiative under your leadership. The Vanderbilt Foundation grant provided Luna with resources to establish her own educational institution, while maintaining her academic studies and legal research. More importantly, it gave her the credibility and institutional backing that would be essential for confronting established community leaders in Copper Ridge. Luna's decision about where to locate her experimental school was strategic rather than merely practical. After careful research, she identified Silver Creek, Colorado, a mining community approximately 50 miles from Copper Ridge that faced similar social and economic challenges but lacked the specific history that complicated her relationship with her birthplace. Establishing the Mountain West Academy for Inclusive Education in Silver Creek would allow Luna to demonstrate the effectiveness of her educational and social integration methods in a mining community context while building regional reputation and influence that would eventually support her confrontation with Copper Ridge. The Academy's mission statement reflected Luna's comprehensive approach to addressing systematic discrimination to demonstrate that communities prosper when they embrace rather than exclude human diversity, and that exceptional potential can emerge from any background when provided with appropriate support and opportunity. Luna's recruitment strategy. For the Academy focused on identifying exceptionally capable students who had been overlooked or excluded by traditional educational institutions. She sought children with learning differences, physical challenges, unusual backgrounds, and other characteristics that might have limited their opportunities in conventional schools. Marcus Thompson, her childhood friend from the sanctuary of St. Catherine, became one of the Academy's first students and eventually its first graduate to gain admission to a prestigious university, despite his speech impediment and humble background. Rebecca Martinez, the girl who had lost her arm in an accident, discovered that her perceived disability actually enhanced her abilities in certain academic and artistic areas. Under Luna's guidance, she developed innovative approaches to problem solving that impressed university professors and potential employers. The Academy's success in developing overlooked talent quickly attracted attention from throughout the Mountain West region. Parents began traveling significant distances to enroll children who had struggled in traditional educational environments, and educators came to observe Luna's methods and adapt them for their own institutions. More importantly for Luna's long-term strategy, the Academy's reputation began reaching Copper Ridge through the interconnected networks of mining communities throughout the region. Reports of Luna's work began circulating in ways that prepared the groundwork for her eventual direct confrontation with the community that had rejected her. There's a remarkable young woman running an experimental school over in Silver Creek, Thomas Henderson mentioned to his wife, Martha, during dinner one evening in 1908. Thomas was the son of the midwife who had delivered Luna 16 years earlier, though he was unaware of the connection. They say she's achieving incredible results with students that other schools couldn't handle. Some folks think she might be the future of education in these mining regions. By her 16th birthday, Luna Walker had transformed herself from a rejected infant into a nationally recognized educator, legal scholar, and social justice advocate. She possessed financial resources, professional credentials, legal expertise, and strategic alliances that would support whatever approach she ultimately chose for confronting Copper Ridge. More importantly, she had developed the emotional maturity and strategic thinking necessary to pursue justice through transformation rather than destruction. Luna was preparing to return to her birthplace not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a powerful advocate for social change who could offer the community something valuable while demanding accountability for past wrongs. The foundation had been built. The resources had been assembled. The strategy had been developed. Luna Walker was ready to begin the final phase of her journey back to Copper Ridge, though the community that had once deemed her too dangerous to keep had no idea that their greatest challenge was approaching. The spring of 1910 brought news that would finally provide Luna Walker with the perfect opportunity to return to Copper Ridge after 18 years of exile. A devastating mine collapse had trapped 12 workers for 3 days, resulting in 6 deaths and leaving the surviving families in desperate economic circumstances. The tragedy had exposed serious safety violations and management negligence that threatened to destroy the community's primary source of employment and economic stability. Luna learned of the disaster through newspaper reports and correspondence from contacts throughout the mining region who kept her informed about developments that might affect her long-term strategy. The Copper Ridge Mining Company was facing lawsuits, federal investigations, and the possibility of permanent closure unless significant safety improvements could be implemented quickly and effectively. More importantly for Luna's purposes, the crisis had created exactly the kind of circumstances where her unique combination of legal expertise, educational innovation, and community development experience could provide valuable solutions to problems that the existing leadership seemed unable to address. This is the opportunity we've been waiting for, Professor Harper told Luna during an emergency strategy session at Stanford University. Copper Ridge needs exactly the kind of expertise you can provide, and their desperation gives you leverage. That wouldn't normally be available to someone challenging established power structures. Luna's initial response to the crisis was carefully calculated to demonstrate her value to the community, while maintaining her strategic distance until the moment was right for direct confrontation. Working through intermediaries, she arranged for the Mountain West Academy to provide emergency educational support for the children of families affected by the mining disaster. The Academy's mobile education unit arrived in Copper Ridge within a week of the mine collapse, staffed by Luna's most experienced teachers and equipped with innovative learning materials designed to help children process trauma while maintaining their academic progress. The program was presented as a charitable initiative from a neighboring community, with no indication of Luna's personal connection to Copper Ridge or her ultimate intentions. Sarah Walker, now 38 years old and worn down by 18 years of guilt about the daughter she had given away, was working as a volunteer coordinator for the disaster relief effort when she first encountered the Academy's educational program. She had spent nearly 2 decades wondering what had become of the pale, silver-haired infant she had been forced to surrender, and the advanced educational methods being demonstrated by Luna's teachers impressed her enormously. "These people understand children in ways I've never seen before," Sarah confided to her friend Margaret Collins, who had been one of the ladies' auxiliary members who had pressured her family to give up Luna years earlier. "They're helping our kids deal with the trauma from the mine disaster while actually advancing their learning. It's like they can see potential that nobody else recognizes." The irony was profound but invisible to everyone except Luna, who was monitoring the situation through detailed reports from her staff members working in Copper Ridge. Her mother was praising educational methods that had been developed partly as a response to the discrimination Luna herself had faced as a child in this very community. Thomas Walker had not survived the mine collapse. He had been one of the 6 workers killed when the main support tunnel collapsed, leaving Sarah widowed and struggling to support herself through occasional work as a seamstress and cleaning lady. The economic devastation that followed the mining accident had reduced many of Copper Ridge's most prominent families to circumstances similar to those the Walker family had faced during Luna's childhood. Luna's intelligence network provided her with detailed information about how the crisis was affecting the community's power structure. The mine closure had eliminated most well-paying jobs, forcing many families to consider relocating to other mining regions where work was available. Property values had collapsed, leaving homeowners with worthless investments. Local businesses were struggling to survive without the economic activity generated by mine workers. Wages, most importantly for Luna's strategic purposes. The community's traditional leadership had proven inadequate to address the complex legal, economic, and social challenges created by the disaster. Mayor William Harrison, who had been one of the officials involved in Luna's exile 18 years earlier, was facing increasing pressure to resign as angry citizens demanded more effective responses to their crisis. Dr. James Morrison, now elderly and struggling with health problems, had been overwhelmed by the medical needs created by the mining accident and its aftermath. The town's limited healthcare facilities were inadequate for treating the severe injuries suffered by survivors, and several families had been forced to seek treatment in Denver at costs they could not afford. Most tellingly, Reverend Michael Patterson had been forced to acknowledge that his congregation's charitable resources were insufficient to address the level of need created by the disaster. The church's traditional role as the community's primary source of moral guidance and practical assistance had been severely undermined by circumstances that exceeded their capacity to respond effectively. Into this leadership vacuum, Luna began introducing carefully planned interventions that would demonstrate her capabilities, while preparing the groundwork for her eventual revelation and confrontation. Working through the Mountain West Academy and other professional organizations, she arranged for legal experts to provide pro bono assistance with the lawsuits against the mining company. Attorney David Martinez, one of Luna's allies from her Stanford network, arrived in Copper Ridge with a team of legal specialists who began building cases that would hold the mining company accountable for safety violations while securing compensation for affected families. The legal support was presented as part of a regional mining safety initiative, with no indication that Luna was the organizing force behind the intervention. "These lawyers understand mining law better than anyone we've dealt with before," Mayor Harrison admitted during a town meeting about the legal proceedings. "They're getting results that our local attorney said were impossible. Families are actually receiving compensation payments, and it looks like the mining company will be forced to implement real safety improvements." The legal victories created goodwill toward the outside experts who had provided assistance while demonstrating that Copper Ridge's problems could be solved with the right kind of professional expertise. Luna was establishing her credibility and value before revealing her identity and demanding accountability for past wrongs. Her next intervention focused on economic development opportunities that could provide alternative employment for displaced mine workers. Luna had identified several industries that could potentially locate facilities in Copper Ridge if the community could demonstrate appropriate infrastructure and workforce capabilities. Working through the Vanderbilt Foundation and other philanthropic networks, Luna arranged for economic development specialists to conduct feasibility studies for establishing textile manufacturing, food processing, and lumber milling operations in the Copper Ridge area. These studies revealed significant economic potential that local leaders had never recognized or pursued. The economic development initiatives required community meetings where residents could learn about new opportunities and contribute to planning processes. Luna attended these meetings as Dr. Luna Mitchell, using her middle name and her mentor's surname to avoid immediate recognition. While observing the community dynamics she would soon confront directly, the 18 years since her exile had changed Luna's appearance dramatically. Her silver-white hair was now styled in sophisticated arrangements that projected professional authority rather than unusual medical condition. Her pale skin was protected by fashionable clothing and accessories that transformed what had once seemed like abnormality into distinctive elegance. Most importantly, her confidence and bearing commanded respect in ways that made her genetic characteristics seem secondary to her obvious intelligence and capability. "Dr. Mitchell certainly knows what she's talking about," commented Betty Thompson, daughter of the elderly woman who had originally denounced Luna as cursed during her attempted baptism. "Her ideas about economic diversification could really help our community recover from the mining disaster. We're lucky to have someone with her expertise willing to work with a small town like ours." The irony was almost overwhelming for Luna, who was listening to praise from the daughter of someone who had considered her presence spiritually dangerous to the community. But the comments also confirmed that her strategy was working. She was being recognized for her abilities, rather than rejected for her appearance. Luna's most emotionally challenging moment during this reconnaissance phase came when she encountered her mother at one of the community meetings about economic development. Sarah Walker, now gray-haired and worn by years of hard work and persistent guilt, sat in the back of the meeting hall, listening intently to discussions about new opportunities that might improve the community's prospects. For a moment, Luna considered revealing her identity immediately, driven by 18 years of wondering about the mother who had been forced to give her away. But strategic discipline prevailed over emotional impulse. The timing was not yet right for personal confrontations that might undermine her carefully constructed position of professional authority. Instead, Luna made careful note of her mother's circumstances and began planning interventions that would improve Sarah's situation without revealing the connection between them. Through intermediaries, She arranged for Sarah to receive employment opportunities and educational support that would enhance her economic security and social standing within the community. Dr. Morrison, the physician who had originally suggested institutional care for Luna's condition, was now struggling with the medical challenges created by the mining disaster. His age and health problems limited his ability to provide adequate care for the complex injuries suffered by mine accident survivors. Luna arranged for medical specialists from her professional network to provide consultation and assistance, positioning this support as part of a regional healthcare initiative rather than personal intervention. The visiting physicians brought advanced treatment methods and equipment that dramatically improved care quality while reducing costs for affected families. The medical support we're receiving is extraordinary, Dr. Morrison admitted during a conversation with Mayor Harrison. These specialists are providing services that would normally cost thousands of dollars, and they're training our local staff in techniques I never learned in medical school. It's almost like someone who understands our exact needs is coordinating this assistance. Dr. Morrison's comment was more perceptive than he realized. Luna was indeed coordinating assistance based on intimate understanding of Copper Ridge's needs and circumstances. Her reconnaissance was providing detailed intelligence about community vulnerabilities and opportunities that would support her eventual confrontation with the leadership that had rejected her. By the end of 1910, Luna had successfully demonstrated her value to Copper Ridge, while remaining unrecognized by the community that had once deemed her too dangerous to keep. She had provided legal, economic, educational, and medical assistance that was helping the community recover from its worst crisis while positioning herself as an indispensable ally whose continued support would be essential for long-term prosperity. The stage was set for the next phase of her strategy, the gradual revelation of her true identity and the systematic demand for accountability from the individuals and institutions that had destroyed her childhood. But now she would make these demands from a position of strength rather than vulnerability, backed by demonstrated expertise and community dependence that would make resistance both difficult and counterproductive. Luna Walker was ready to transform from hidden benefactor to visible challenger, though Copper Ridge had no idea that their greatest test of character was about to begin. The autumn of 1911 brought the moment Luna Walker had been preparing for throughout 18 years of exile, education, and strategic planning. The Copper Ridge Community Development Festival, organized to celebrate the town's recovery from the mining disaster, would serve as the stage for revelations that would forever change how the community understood justice, redemption, and the true cost of discrimination. Luna had orchestrated every aspect of the festival through her network of allies and intermediaries, positioning it as a celebration of community resilience while creating the perfect venue for her ultimate confrontation with the people who had rejected her as an infant. The event would draw together all of Copper Ridge's prominent citizens in a setting where her revelations would have maximum impact and minimum opportunity for private damage control. The festival's centerpiece was the dedication of the new Copper Ridge Educational Center, funded entirely through Luna's philanthropic networks, but presented as the result of community-wide fundraising efforts. The building represented everything Luna had learned about inclusive education and social justice, designed to serve students with diverse needs and backgrounds in ways that the community's previous educational system had never imagined. Mayor William Harrison, now 72 years old and increasingly dependent on the outside assistance that had helped Copper Ridge survive its recent crisis, stood at the podium preparing to introduce the festival's keynote speaker. He had no idea that he was about to face the most challenging moment of his long political career. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Harrison announced to the assembled crowd of nearly 500 people, "we are honored today to hear from Dr. Luna Mitchell, the educational innovator whose vision and generosity have been instrumental in our community's recovery and revitalization. Dr. Mitchell has asked to share some personal reflections on community, acceptance, and the power of second chances. Luna rose from her seat at the head table, wearing an elegant navy blue dress that projected professional authority, while subtly emphasizing the silver-white hair that had once marked her as different and dangerous. Her pale skin, once seen as evidence of spiritual contamination, now seemed to glow with an inner strength that commanded attention and respect. She approached the podium with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to addressing large audiences. But those who looked closely could see the intensity in her pale, pink eyes that suggested this speech would be unlike any other she had delivered. "Thank you, Mayor Harrison," Luna began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "I want to begin by sharing a story about a community that faced a test of its moral character 18 years ago, and about how that community's choices shaped not only the life of one innocent child, but the destiny of everyone gathered here today." The opening words immediately captured the audience's attention, though no one yet understood the personal significance of what they were about to hear. Luna had learned from her years of public speaking that the most powerful revelations came through careful narrative building rather than dramatic announcements that might trigger defensive reactions before her message could be fully delivered. "In 1892, Luna continued, a child was born in this community whose appearance challenged everything the townspeople thought they knew about normal, about acceptable, about the kinds of people who deserved to belong to their society. That child's skin was as pale as winter snow, her hair gleamed like moonlight, and her eyes carried the color of dawn." A murmur began to ripple through the crowd as older residents started to remember the strange circumstances surrounding the Walker family's tragedy nearly 2 decades earlier. Martha Henderson, now in her 80s but still sharp-minded, felt a chill of recognition as memories she had tried to suppress came flooding back. The community's leaders decided that this child represented a threat to their social order, Luna said, her voice growing stronger as she approached the heart of her revelation. They convinced themselves that her unusual appearance was evidence of spiritual contamination that could spread to other families if she remained among them. They forced her parents to choose between keeping their daughter and losing everything they had worked to build in Copper Ridge. Sarah Walker, sitting in the middle section of the audience, had gone completely pale as she began to understand the direction of Luna's speech. The voice, the bearing, the particular shade of those distinctive eyes, all of it was triggering memories she had spent 18 years trying to forget. That child was taken from her family at 6 months old and sent to an institution in San Francisco, where she was expected to live out her days in exile from the community that had deemed her too dangerous to keep. Luna continued, her gaze sweeping across the crowd and settling briefly on the faces of people who had been instrumental in her removal. "But what the community didn't understand," Luna said, her voice now carrying an edge of steel that made everyone in the audience pay closer attention, was that they were not eliminating a problem. They were creating someone who would spend the next 18 years building the knowledge, resources, and determination necessary to return and demand accountability for what they had done. The moment of recognition hit different people at different times, like ripples spreading across a pond. Dr. Morrison, despite his advanced age, suddenly understood why the medical consultant who had been helping his practice seemed so familiar. Reverend Patterson felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications of what he was hearing. "My name," Luna announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "is not Dr. Luna Mitchell. My name is Luna Walker, and I am the child you sent away in 1892 because you were too frightened and too narrow-minded to accept that God's creation includes more diversity than your limited understanding could accommodate." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly that could be felt as much as heard. Some people gasped audibly, others sat in stunned silence, and a few began whispering frantically to their neighbors as they tried to process the implications of what they had just learned. Sarah Walker let out a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul as she stared at the poised, accomplished woman who was revealing herself to be the baby she had been forced to give away 18 years earlier. The daughter she had wondered about every day for nearly 2 decades was standing before her as a figure of power and authority rather than the broken victim she had always imagined. For 18 years, Luna continued, maintaining her composure. Despite the emotional intensity of the moment, I have been preparing for this day. I have built the educational expertise that has helped your children learn and grow. I have developed the legal knowledge that has protected your families from corporate exploitation. I have cultivated the professional networks that have brought economic opportunities to your community. She paused to let the implications of her words sink in before delivering the most devastating part of her revelation. Every improvement your community has experienced since the mining disaster has been orchestrated by the child you once considered too cursed to keep. The legal victories, the economic development, the educational innovations, the medical assistance, all of it has come from someone you rejected because you were too ignorant and too cruel to recognize that difference can be a source of strength rather than a threat. Mayor Harrison, who had been sitting in shocked silence, finally found his voice. Luna. If you really are who you claim to be, I want you to know that we've always wondered what became of you. We hoped that you had found a good life somewhere. Luna's response was swift and unforgiving. You hoped, Mayor Harrison? You hoped that the infant you forced into exile had somehow thrived despite being torn from her family and community? Did you also hope that your cruelty would have no consequences, that your moral failure would never be called to account? The mayor's attempt at reconciliation had backfired, exposing the shallow nature of whatever regret the community's leadership might have developed over the years. Luna had not returned seeking forgiveness or reconciliation on their terms. She had returned as a force for justice that would reshape the community according to her vision of moral accountability. Dr. Morrison, Luna said, turning her attention to the elderly physician who had originally recommended her institutionalization. You suggested that I be examined by specialists in Denver who might find ways to treat my condition. Those specialists confirmed that I had albinism, a genetic variation that affects pigmentation but has no impact on intelligence, character, or moral worth. You recommended exiling a healthy child because you were ignorant about basic genetics. Dr. Morrison struggled to his feet, his age and guilt making his movements uncertain. Luna, I was trying to help. We didn't understand your condition, and we thought it might be best for everyone. Best for everyone? Luna's voice carried a note of incredulity that silenced the crowd. Best for everyone except the child whose life you destroyed with your ignorance and fear. Best for everyone except the parents who spent 18 years grieving for the daughter they were forced to abandon. She turned to face Reverend Patterson, whose leadership of the community's moral authority had been instrumental in justifying her exile. Reverend Patterson, you allowed Mrs. Thompson to stand up in your church and denounce an infant as marked by darkness. You permitted the persecution of a child in the name of Christian values. Where in your theology did you find justification for driving an innocent baby from the community that should have protected her? Reverend Patterson, now in his 70s, seemed to age another decade as he confronted the moral reckoning he had avoided for 18 years. Luna, we were afraid. We didn't understand what your condition meant, and people were talking about spiritual contamination. I should have been stronger, should have provided better leadership. Yes, Luna replied coldly, you should have. But instead, you chose the convenience of satisfying popular prejudice over the difficulty of teaching Christian compassion. You failed in the most fundamental duty of spiritual leadership, protecting the vulnerable from those who would harm them. The crowd had grown restless as Luna's accusations became more specific and pointed. Some people were clearly uncomfortable with the confrontational tone, while others seemed transfixed by the dramatic revelation and its Implications for their community's future. Luna recognized that she had reached the moment where her strategy would either succeed in transforming the community or trigger a defensive reaction that could undermine her carefully laid plans. She needed to shift from accusation to proposition, offering the community a path forward that served both justice and their practical interests. "I have not returned to Copper Ridge seeking revenge," Luna announced, her voice becoming more measured and authoritative. "I have returned seeking transformation. This community has a choice to make today, the same kind of choice you faced 18 years ago, when you decided that fear was more important than compassion." She outlined the terms of what she privately thought of as the Copper Ridge Compact, comprehensive agreement that would restructure the community's institutions according to principles of inclusion, accountability, and genuine moral leadership. The educational center would be renamed the Luna Walker Center for Inclusive Learning, with policies specifically designed to serve students who might otherwise face discrimination or exclusion. The community would establish an official policy of non-discrimination based on physical appearance, genetic variation, or family background. Most importantly, the community would create a truth and reconciliation process that would examine other cases where individuals or families had faced systematic prejudice, with the goal of preventing future injustices while addressing past wrongs. You can choose to embrace these changes and build a community that values human dignity over conformity, Luna concluded. Or you can reject accountability and watch as the resources and opportunities I have provided are redirected to communities that demonstrate greater commitment to justice and moral progress. The choice she was offering was both generous and ruthless: transformation or consequences, growth or decline, justice or continued moral failure. After 18 years of preparation, Luna Walker was finally in a position to reshape the community that had once rejected her, and she intended to use that power wisely but decisively. The silence that followed her ultimatum was heavy with implications that would determine not just Copper Ridge's response to her demands, but the future of everyone who called the community home. The 3 hours that followed, Luna Walker's dramatic revelation at the Copper Ridge Community Development Festival, would be remembered as the most transformative period in the town's history. As the stunned crowd slowly dispersed from the main assembly, smaller groups formed throughout the community, each grappling with the implications of what they had learned and the choice Luna had presented to them. In the Methodist Church, Reverend Patterson convened an emergency meeting with the town's religious leaders and prominent families. The conversation was heated, painful, and ultimately revealing about the community's capacity for genuine moral growth versus defensive self-protection. "We need to understand what we're really facing here," said James Mitchell, the banker who had taken over much of Patrick Sullivan's role after the older man's death several years earlier. "This woman, Luna, has essentially been manipulating our community for over a year. She's been deceiving us about her identity while positioning herself to make demands that could fundamentally change how we operate." Mrs. Betty Thompson, now a middle-aged woman who served as president of the Ladies' Auxiliary, nodded in agreement. "There's something deeply disturbing about someone who would orchestrate such an elaborate scheme. How can we trust anything she's told us if she was lying about who she was from the beginning?" But these defensive reactions were challenged by voices that had been notably absent during Luna's original persecution: community members who had developed enough moral courage over the intervening years to question their past actions rather than simply defending them. Dr. Samuel Harrison, a young physician who had recently joined Dr. Morrison's practice, spoke up with a perspective that silenced the room. "With respect to everyone present, I think we're focusing on the wrong issue. The question isn't whether Luna Walker was deceptive about her identity. The question is whether she was right about our moral failures and whether we have the courage to address them honestly." The young doctor's words carried particular weight because he had worked closely with the medical specialists Luna had brought to Copper Ridge. And he understood better than most how sophisticated and genuinely helpful her interventions had been. "I've seen the educational methods she developed," Dr. Harrison continued. "I've worked with the legal experts she provided. I've observed the economic development initiatives she coordinated. Every single intervention has been designed to help our community, while specifically addressing the kinds of problems that would have prevented someone like her from thriving here as a child." Meanwhile, at the Walker family's modest home on the outskirts of town, a very different conversation was taking place between Luna and the mother who had been forced to give her away 18 years earlier. Sarah Walker, now 49 years, old and worn by years of hard work and persistent guilt, sat across from the accomplished woman her baby daughter had become. "I want you to know," Sarah said, her voice trembling with 18 years of suppressed emotion, "that not a single day passed when I didn't wonder what had become of you. I used to imagine what you might look like as you grew older, what you might be learning, whether you were happy or sad or angry about what we had done to you." Luna studied her mother's face, seeing not the young woman who had been overwhelmed by community pressure, but someone who had carried genuine grief and regret throughout the intervening years. The anger that had fueled Luna's determination to return was complicated by recognition of her mother's own suffering. "I know you didn't want to send me away," Luna replied carefully. "I've spent years studying the social dynamics that existed in 1892, and I understand that you had virtually no power to resist community pressure. But I also need you to understand that being right about the circumstances doesn't eliminate the harm that was done or the obligation to ensure it never happens again." Their conversation continued for hours, moving through grief, explanation, anger, and slowly toward something that might eventually become reconciliation. Sarah learned about Luna's years at the sanctuary, her extraordinary education, her experiences with Native American communities, and her gradual transformation from victim to advocate. Luna learned about her mother's years of struggling with poverty and social isolation, her persistent guilt about the choice she had been forced to make, and her quiet efforts to help other families facing discrimination or hardship within the Sinju community. "After you were taken away," Sarah explained, "I couldn't bear to have another child. The thought of bringing another baby into a world where they might face rejection for being different, I just couldn't take that risk again." The personal cost of the community's moral failure was becoming clear in ways that went far beyond Luna's individual suffering. Families had been broken, potential had been wasted, and an entire generation had grown up in a community that taught fear of difference rather than appreciation for diversity. But the most significant conversations of that transformative evening were taking place in the town hall, where Mayor Harrison had called an emergency meeting of the city council and community leaders to formally respond to Luna's ultimatum. The choice Luna had presented was stark and unambiguous: embrace comprehensive reforms that would transform Copper Ridge into a genuinely inclusive community, or lose the resources and opportunities that had enabled their recovery from the mining disaster. The economic implications were sobering. Luna's educational center represented an investment of over $50,000 and provided employment for 12 local residents. The legal support she had coordinated had secured compensation payments totaling nearly $200,000 for families affected by the mining disaster. The economic development initiatives she had facilitated could potentially bring hundreds of new jobs to the region over the next several years. More importantly, Luna's professional reputation and networks had attracted attention from investors, educators, and government officials who were considering Copper Ridge as a location for various projects and initiatives. Losing her support would not only eliminate existing benefits, but would signal to other potential partners that the community was hostile to progressive leadership and inclusive values. "We need to be realistic about our options," Mayor Harrison told the assembled council members. "Miss Walker, Luna has demonstrated that she has the resources and expertise to either support our community's development or to redirect those resources elsewhere. She's not making empty threats. Council member Robert Chun, whose family had moved to Copper Ridge during the post-disaster reconstruction period, provided a perspective that hadn't been available during Luna's original persecution. I've worked with Dr. Mitchell Luna on several development projects over the past year, Chun said. Her competence is extraordinary, her commitment to community welfare is genuine, and her methods are more effective than anything our traditional leadership has achieved. The question we should be asking is not whether we can afford to accept her conditions, but whether we can afford to reject someone with her capabilities. The debate continued until nearly midnight, with arguments ranging from principled acceptance of moral responsibility to pragmatic calculations about economic necessity. But the most compelling voice in the discussion belonged to someone whose perspective bridged both considerations. Marcus Thompson, Luna's childhood friend from the sanctuary of St. Catherine, had arrived in Copper Ridge that afternoon as part of Luna's support team. Now 29 years old and serving as assistant director of the Mountain West Academy, Marcus possessed unique insights into both Luna's character and the transformative potential of her vision. I've known Luna since we were both children. Facing rejection from communities that couldn't see past our differences, Marcus told the council. I've watched her transform personal pain into social progress, individual suffering into collective healing. She's not seeking revenge against Copper Ridge. She's offering you the opportunity to become the kind of community that other towns will study and emulate. Marcus's speech was accompanied by documentation about the Mountain West Academy's success. In nearby Silver Creek, where Luna's methods had transformed not just educational outcomes, but the entire social climate of the community. Property values had increased, new businesses had been attracted to the area, and the town had developed a regional reputation for innovation and inclusivity that brought benefits far beyond the educational sector. Copper Ridge has the opportunity to become a model for how communities can grow and prosper by embracing rather than fearing human diversity, Marcus concluded. Luna is offering to share everything she's learned about creating inclusive, thriving communities. The only question is whether you have the wisdom and courage to accept her gift. The council's vote was unanimous in favor of accepting Luna's terms and implementing the Copper Ridge Compact. But the decision reflected more than mere pragmatic calculation. Over the course of that long, difficult evening, the community's leaders had been forced to confront the moral implications of their past actions and to choose between defensive denial and transformative growth. The months that followed, Luna's revelation brought changes to Copper Ridge that exceeded even her most optimistic projections. The Luna Walker Center for Inclusive Learning became a regional destination for families seeking educational opportunities for children with diverse learning needs and backgrounds. The community's official non-discrimination policies attracted attention from civil rights organizations and legal scholars who recognized Copper Ridge as a pioneer in protecting individuals from appearance-based prejudice. The model policies Luna had developed were adopted by communities throughout the Mountain West region and eventually influenced state and federal civil rights legislation. The Truth and Reconciliation process revealed dozens of cases where individuals or families had faced systematic discrimination based on physical differences, ethnic background, economic status, or other characteristics that challenged the community's narrow definition of acceptable diversity. Most remarkably, the process of examining past injustices and implementing inclusive reforms had transformed Copper Ridge from a struggling mining town into a thriving regional center known for educational innovation, economic diversity, and social justice leadership. Luna's personal reconciliation with her family and birthplace evolved gradually over several years. She maintained her primary residence in California, but spent increasing amounts of time in Copper Ridge as the community's transformation accelerated and deepened. Her relationship with her mother developed from painful confrontation through difficult honesty to genuine affection and mutual respect. Sarah Walker became one of the most effective advocates for the inclusive policies Luna had implemented, using her personal experience of loss and regret to help other families understand the importance of acceptance and support for children who were different. Dr. Morrison, despite his advanced age and failing health, worked tirelessly to document the medical and social aspects of Luna's case, creating educational materials that would help other communities avoid the mistakes Copper Ridge had made in 1892. His research was published in medical journals and became required reading in medical schools throughout the country. Reverend Patterson resigned from his position as head of the Methodist Church and spent his remaining years working with interfaith organizations to develop theological frameworks for understanding physical diversity as part of divine creation rather than evidence of spiritual contamination. But perhaps the most significant measure of Luna's success was evident in the generation of children who grew up in Copper Ridge after its transformation. These young people understood diversity as normal and valuable, discrimination as unacceptable and harmful, and social justice as everyone's responsibility rather than someone else's problem. Luna turned 30 in 1922, 10 years after her dramatic revelation. Copper Ridge organized a community celebration that honored both her personal achievements and the collective transformation she had inspired. The festivities drew visitors from throughout the region who wanted to observe the community that had become synonymous with inclusive education and social justice. The keynote speaker at the celebration was Chief Robert Standing Bear, the Lakota leader who had mentored Luna in understanding how marginalized communities could create positive social change. His speech connected Luna's individual journey to broader patterns of social evolution and moral progress. This young woman represents something that rarely appears in human history, Chief Standing Bear told the assembled crowd. She had the power to seek revenge against those who had wronged her, but instead chose to use that power for healing and transformation. She could have allowed bitterness to consume her spirit, but instead transformed suffering into wisdom that benefits entire communities. Luna's response to the celebration reflected the spiritual and emotional growth she had experienced during her decade of active engagement with the community that had once rejected her. 10 years ago, I returned to Copper Ridge seeking justice, Luna told the crowd. What I found was the opportunity to create something far more valuable than personal vindication. Together, we have built a community that proves that human beings can choose growth over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and love over hatred. As Luna looked out over the crowd that had gathered to honor her contributions, she saw faces that represented the full spectrum of human diversity: children and adults of various ethnic backgrounds, individuals with visible and invisible disabilities, families that challenged traditional definitions of normal appearance and social structure. The terrified infant who had been deemed too dangerous to keep had become the architect of a community where no child would ever face rejection for being different. The prophecy that Joseph Crow Feather had shared years earlier had been fulfilled in ways that transcended both Native American spiritual traditions and European American social expectations. Luna Walker had transformed herself from victim to victor, from outcast to leader, from cursed child to blessed prophet of social change. More importantly, she had proven that communities could choose to evolve beyond their own prejudices and fears when confronted with moral leadership that combined compassion with strength, wisdom with determination, and justice with mercy. Moonchild had indeed brought prophecy to fulfillment, but it was a prophecy of hope rather than doom, transformation rather than destruction, healing rather than revenge. In learning to see difference as gift rather than curse, Copper Ridge had discovered possibilities for community that exceeded anything their ancestors had imagined, and in the process, They had created a legacy that would inspire similar transformations in communities throughout the American West and beyond, proving that the power of one determined individual could indeed change the world, one heart and one community at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.